The ice scraped against Seren's ankles as she trudged through the blizzard. Each breath shallower than the last, each step heavier than the one before. The horizon of Mir 7 stretched before her, an endless expanse of white against dark gray skies, broken only by the skeletal remains of abandoned georigs and the fractured domes of failed settlements. She clutched Ariel tighter to her chest, wrapping the last thermal sheet around his tiny purple body. Her son's faint, bioluminescent freckles had dimmed to an alarming paleness, barely visible against his skin. 4.5 years old, and the light within him was fading. Once, Mir 7 had promised so much. Horizon Axis conglomerate had painted visions of terraformed paradise. Orbital heat arrays would warm the atmosphere. Geothermal reactors would power cities. Trade routes would bring prosperity. But the moon proved too volatile. The weather too violent. When funds vanished, so did the populace, leaving only the desperate behind. Desperate, like Seren. "Stay with me, little one," she whispered, her words immediately stolen by the howling wind. Just a little further. But there was nowhere further to go. The last automated trading post had scanned her wristband and sealed its doors. The AI turret had intoned the same message as the 5 before it. Insufficient status. No credits detected. Access denied. Seren's legs finally gave way. She sank to her knees in the snow, still cradling Ariel. The cold had long ago numbed her extremities. But now, it reached deeper, toward her core. Her breathing slowed. Perhaps this was for the best. After the silver hearthcast had exiled her, branding her fractured and unclean, following her mate's death, what future remained for a single mother in this frozen wasteland? "I'm sorry," she murmured to Ariel, kissing his forehead. His normally bright freckles were almost extinguished now. She wrapped him tighter in the thermal sheet, tucking his small face against her neck where the last of her body heat lingered. "Dream warm, my starlight." Serene closed her eyes, resigned to the inevitable. They would freeze together. At least, she would not leave him alone in the cold. As consciousness began to slip away, the wind seemed to change pitch. A distant humming penetrated the howl of the storm. Seren was too far gone to wonder what it might be. It didn't matter now. The darkness took her. Miles Cater squinted through the view screen of his climate shelter, adjusting the gain on his failing relay array. A flicker had caught his attention, something moving out there in the white void. Probably just another fragment of debris torn loose by the storm. But on Mir 7, curiosity was sometimes the only thing that kept sanity intact. He tugged on his thermal suit, secured his face shield, and grabbed the emergency kit. The outer door hissed as pressure equalized, then slid open to the fury of the blizzard. Miles trudged into the white, following the coordinates he'd marked. 20 minutes later, he found them, a purple-skinned woman and child, literally frozen in the drift. For a moment, he stood motionless. They were obviously aliens, not human like himself. Mir 7 was supposed to be abandoned except for a handful of salvagers and self-imposed exiles like himself. Where had they come from? How had they ended up here, in the middle of nowhere? The questions didn't matter. What mattered was that they weren't quite dead yet. Miles yanked open his thermal satchel, withdrew heat packs, and pressed them against the child's chest and the woman's core. He wrapped them both in his emergency thermal blanket, then lifted them, surprisingly light in the low gravity, and began the arduous trek back to his shelter. As he carried them through the storm, Miles felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the weight of responsibility for another life. He'd fled to Mir 7 to escape exactly this feeling, to punish himself with isolation after failing to save his niece. Now, he found himself whispering to these strangers through his face mask. "Stay with me. Just a little longer. We're almost there." The shelter appeared through the whiteout, a repurposed climate control outpost with its patchwork of salvaged metal and patched insulation. Miles staggered through the outer door, waited for it to seal, then rushed to the inner chamber. Inside, he laid the child into a makeshift heat cradle, a mining blanket draped over an emergency lamp, and positioned the woman near the reactor vent where warm air cycled through. He administered a careful dose of warm electrolyte fluid to the child, whose freckles seemed to glow faintly in response. "That's it," Miles murmured, watching the boy's chest rise and fall with slightly stronger breaths. "Fight!" Hours passed. Miles alternated between checking vital signs and making broth from his meager stores. The child stabilized first, his freckles gradually brightening from pale blue to a steadier aquamarine. The woman took longer, her breathing shallow but persistent. Finally, her eyes flickered open, deep violet irises focused slowly on the unfamiliar ceiling. Then, darted around the room in confusion before settling on Miles. "Your son is alive," Miles said immediately, gesturing to the heat cradle where the boy still slept. "He's warming up. You're both safe." The woman stared at him, uncomprehending or unable to speak. Miles set down a cup of weak broth beside her. "Drink, slowly." She reached for the cup with trembling fingers. Sipped once, then again. Color gradually returned to her cheeks, a deeper purple hue that Miles found strangely beautiful. "Miles," he said, pointing to himself. She swallowed, her voice rusty when it finally came. "Seren." "Seren," he repeated. "And the boy?" "Ariel." Her eyes moved to her son, filling with disbelief. "He lives?" "Yes. I found you both in the snow. You kept him warm enough, long enough." Seren shook her head slightly. "You saved him. I had given up." The simple admission hung in the air between them. Miles didn't know how to respond. He understood giving up all too well. Instead, he busied himself checking the reactor vent, adjusting its flow to maintain the temperature. His shelter wasn't designed for 3 people, especially not when 2 needed serious recovery. Resources would stretch thin quickly. Seren watched him work, her gaze analytical despite her weakness. When he returned to check on Ariel, she spoke again. "You live here alone?" Miles nodded. "For 2 years now." "Why?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. No one had asked him why in a very long time. "To forget," he answered honestly. "Or to remember. Sometimes I'm not sure which." Seren seemed to understand. She nodded slightly. Then her eyes drifted to Ariel again. "The Silver Hearth would say you carried our lifeblood back from the threshold. A sacred debt." Miles didn't understand the reference, but he recognized ritual language when he heard it. No debt. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Seren said with surprising firmness. "They would not." She didn't elaborate, and Miles didn't press. Instead, he showed her how to adjust the heat cradle's settings and went to check on his greenhouse annex, a battered half-dome where he cultivated the sparse plants that supplemented his rations. The storm had damaged some of the external seals again. More repairs needed. As he worked, memories surfaced unbidden. His niece Talia, burning with fever in the medvan. The structural collapse warning. His decision to report the danger rather than evacuate immediately. The subsequent delay in protocols. The crushing weight of rubble. Talia's last breaths in his arms. Miles had been a safety engineer then. The whistleblower whose report came too late. The survivor who shouldn't have survived. He slammed his palm against the metal workbench, the sharp pain grounding him back in the present. He had guests now. Responsibilities. This was no time for ghosts. When he returned to the main chamber, he found Seren sitting upright beside Ariel's cradle, singing softly in a language he didn't recognize. The melody was strange, intervals that seemed to clash, then resolve in unexpected ways. But there was beauty in it, and clearly purpose. Her hand rested on Ariel's forehead, and the boy's freckles pulsed gently in rhythm with the song. Miles hesitated in the doorway, not wanting to interrupt what was obviously a ritual of some kind. But Seren sensed his presence and fell silent. "A healing chant," she explained without being asked. "From the Silver Hearth. Though I have no right to use it anymore. Seems to be working," Miles observed as Ariel stirred slightly. "Why wouldn't you have the right?" Seren's face hardened. "I was a midwife once, keeper of sacred pools, singer of first breath songs. But when my mate died in the frost storm, I wailed for 3 cycles instead of 1. I refused the cleansing rituals. The elders said my spirit was fractured." Her voice took on a formal tone, as if reciting, "A fractured vessel cannot hold the sacred waters. A cracked bell cannot ring the true tone." "So they exiled you? For grieving too long?" "For grieving incorrectly," Seren corrected. "There are proper ways to mourn, ways that honor the departed without disrupting the communal harmony. I disrupted." Miles recognized the pain beneath her matter-of-fact explanation. Religious rigidity disguised as concern. Authoritarianism masked as tradition. The same forces that had crushed free thought in the corporate enclaves he'd fled from. "Your son," he said carefully. "He was born before or after your mate died?" "Before. But after Lauren died, I became unclean. Ariel too, by extension." She stroked the boy's luminescent freckles. "A child should have 2 parents. A fractured home creates fractured children." They said. Miles felt a surge of anger on her behalf, but kept his expression neutral. "And you ended up here, on Mir 7? "We fled for 2 years. Station to station. The commune has influence. Doors closed to us everywhere. Credits ran out. Finally, we heard Mir 7 had abandoned outposts. Maybe functional shelter." She gestured weakly. "We underestimated the cold." Ariel stirred again, his eyes fluttering open, startlingly bright turquoise against his purple skin. He blinked at Miles, then at his mother. "Mama," he whispered. "The lights came back." Seren embraced him gently. "Yes, little one. The lights came back." Ariel pointed at Miles. "Who?" "His name is Miles. He helped us when we were cold." The boy studied Miles with curious intensity. Finally, he declared, "You not scary." Miles couldn't help but smile at the simple assessment. "I try not to be." "Hungry?" Ariel announced next. Miles prepared a thin nutrient broth, suitable for recovery. As Ariel sipped from the cup his mother held, Miles noticed Seren, watching him prepare the meal. There was something in her gaze, not just gratitude, but assessment. She was taking his measure, deciding whether to trust him beyond this moment of crisis. He couldn't blame her. Trust came hard on Mir 7. It came hard everywhere. That night, Miles gave up his sleeping alcove to Seren and Ariel, making a temporary bed for himself near the reactor controls. But sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his niece's face overlaid with Ariel's. 2 children, both nearly lost. One he had failed, one he had saved, for now. In the darkness, he heard Seren's voice, barely a whisper as she sang to Ariel. The alien melody twisted through the shelter, somehow, both mournful and hopeful at once. Miles listened until it lulled him to sleep. The next morning, Miles found Seren inspecting his stock of repair supplies. She turned when he entered, not embarrassed to be caught looking. "Your insulation seals are failing," she said directly, "and your vent system loses heat. I can help." Miles blinked in surprise. "You know environmental systems?" "I was keeper of the Silver Hearth, maintainer of perfect temperature for the birthing pools." She gestured to a roll of duct insulation. "Not so different from this." Miles had his doubts about that, but he was in no position to refuse help. Resources were limited, and the storm showed no signs of abating. If they were going to survive, they needed every system functioning at peak efficiency. "All right," he agreed. "We'll start with the vents." For the next several hours, They worked side by side. Miles was surprised by Seren's aptitude. Though the technology was unfamiliar to her, she quickly grasped the principles involved. Her fingers were nimble as she wrapped insulation and patched seals. Occasionally, she would hum fragments of those strange melodies, especially when confronted with a difficult repair. Ariel watched from his heat cradle, still too weak to move much but alert and curious. Miles fashioned a simple toy from spare parts, a small drone that could hover a few inches off the ground. Ariel's face lit up, quite literally, his freckles glowing brighter, when Miles demonstrated how it worked. "For me?" the boy asked incredulously. "For you," Miles confirmed. "When you're stronger, you can chase it around the shelter." Seren paused in her work, watching the interaction with an unreadable expression. "Finally," she said. "You are kind to him." Miles shrugged uncomfortably. "Kids need toys." After they'd repaired the most critical systems, Miles showed Seren a crate of salvaged archive chips he'd collected over the years. Most were damaged, but some still functioned, containing fragments of stories, music, and technical manuals from a dozen worlds. "Entertainment options are limited here," he explained, sorting through the chips. "But sometimes these help pass the time." He handed her a chip labeled Third Cycle Lullabies, one he'd never been able to decode properly. To his surprise, Seren's eyes widened in recognition. "These are Silver Hearth songs," she whispered, turning the chip over in her hands. "Sacred chants for the third phase of gestation. How did you come to possess this?" Miles shrugged. "Salvage. Found it in an abandoned trade ship about a year ago. You can read it?" "Not read. Feel." She pressed the chip between her palms and closed her eyes. After a moment, she began to hum a complex, multi-layered melody that somehow matched the strange intervals Miles had heard the night before. "These songs warm the spirit," Seren explained when she finished. "They prepare the child to emerge into the colder outer world." Miles nodded, though he didn't fully understand. What he did understand was the reverence in her voice, the momentary peace in her expression. For an instant, she wasn't an exile or a refugee. She was a keeper of tradition, a vessel of knowledge. "You should keep it," he said impulsively, closing her fingers around the chip. "It belongs with someone who knows its worth." That night, for the first time since arriving, Seren slept. Real sleep, not the fitful dozing of recovery. Miles sat in the corner, pretending to read another archive chip, but actually watching over Ariel while Seren rested. The boy's breathing had strengthened, his freckles maintaining a steady glow. Miles found himself wondering where they would go when the storm passed. Back into the void of space, seeking another temporary shelter. The thought troubled him more than it should have. The next morning, Miles woke to find Seren already up, carefully inspecting the greenhouse annex. Ariel sat propped against the wall nearby, playing with the hovering drone. "Your heat regulation is inefficient," Seren observed without preamble. "The plants struggle." Miles nodded, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Greenhouse was badly damaged in a storm last season. Never got it fully operational again." "We should fix it," Seren stated, as if it were obvious. "Growing food is surviving." Miles studied her face. "We? You're planning to stay, then?" Seren's expression shuddered slightly. "Until Ariel is strong, until the worst storms pass, we will not be a burden." "That's not what I meant," Miles said quickly. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need. I've been alone a long time. It's an adjustment." Seren regarded him for a long moment, then nodded once. "For me also, adjustment." They spent that day in the greenhouse, Seren applying her knowledge of climate control in surprisingly effective ways. She used scraps of thermal fabric to create insulation baffles that directed the limited heat more efficiently. By midday, the temperature had already improved several degrees. Ariel sat in a corner, watchful and quiet, occasionally asking questions about the plants or the dome structure. His natural curiosity seemed to be returning with his strength, and Miles found himself explaining basic engineering principles to the attentive child. "Why you live here alone?" Ariel asked suddenly, his turquoise eyes unblinking. Miles hesitated, unsure how to answer. I made a mistake once. Someone I cared about got hurt because of me. Being here helps me remember to be careful." "Did they die?" The directness of a child, unyielding. "Yes," Miles admitted. "My niece. She was younger than you." Ariel considered this, his freckles pulsing slowly. "Were you sad?" "Very sad. Mama was sad when Papa died. She cried and sang and the elders got angry." He picked at a piece of moss. "Is that why you're here? Elders got angry?" Miles glanced at Seren, who was pretending not to listen as she adjusted a heat exchanger. "No. No elders. I put myself here because I was angry at myself." Ariel nodded sagely, as if this made perfect sense. Mama was angry at herself too. She said we were going to find a new home, but there wasn't one. "There might be," Miles said softly. "Someday." That evening, over a meager meal of nutrient paste, supplemented with the first moss harvest from the improved greenhouse, Seren asked Miles about his past. He was surprised by her interest, but found himself speaking more openly than he had in years. "I was a safety engineer for Horizon Axis, the corporation that tried to terraform Mir 7. My job was to identify structural weaknesses, potential hazards. I was good at it. Too good, maybe." He stared into his cup. "There was an incident at a pediatric facility. I identified critical flaws in the support systems, filed reports, followed protocols, but the managers buried the warnings. Too costly to fix. Too much downtime." "And it failed," Seren guessed. Miles nodded. "During a routine pressure test, my niece was there for treatment. I was visiting. When the first signs of structural failure appeared, I had a choice: evacuate immediately or trigger the emergency alert system. I chose the alert, thinking it would initiate the full evacuation protocol." His voice grew tight. "There was a delay, 17 minutes between alert and response. By then, the east wing had collapsed." "Your niece," Seren said softly. "Talia," Miles confirmed. "I pulled her from the rubble myself, held her while she died. 26 others didn't make it either. The inquiry cleared me of wrongdoing, said I'd done everything by the book. But the book was wrong." "So you exiled yourself," Seren observed. "Like my people exiled me?" "Yes, except I deserved it." Serene's eyes flashed. "Did the children who died deserve their fate? Did the parents who lost them deserve their grief?" The question struck Miles like a physical blow. "Of course not." "Then why do you deserve punishment? Were you malicious? Did you wish harm?" "No, but I made the wrong choice." "With the knowledge you had then, or the knowledge you have now?" Seren challenged. Miles had no answer. They finished the meal in silence, but her words echoed in his mind. Had he really come to Mir 7 to punish himself, or to hide from a world that continued despite his mistakes? That night, Miles couldn't sleep. He checked and rechecked the environmental controls, inventoried supplies, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. Around midnight, he noticed the temperature in the main chamber dropping. The storm outside had intensified, putting additional strain on the heating system. He found Seren already awake, sitting beside Ariel's sleeping form. Without speaking, she rose to help Miles adjust the heat exchangers. They worked in comfortable silence, moving around each other as if they'd done so for years rather than days. When the temperature stabilized, Seren didn't return to her alcove. Instead, she sat beside Miles near the reactor vent, both of them watching the indicator lights pulse on the control panel. "I considered ending it once," Seren said suddenly, her voice barely audible above the hum of machinery. Lying in the snow with Ariel, never to wake. When you found us, I had already surrendered. The confession stunned Miles. But you kept Ariel wrapped, protected. You were trying to save him. Yes, even in my despair. I tried. But I knew it wasn't enough. She looked at Miles directly. You judge yourself for your niece's death. Should I not judge myself for nearly causing my son's? That's different, Miles protested. You were desperate with no options left. And you? Were you not acting on the best information you had, with the best intentions? Miles fell silent, unable to counter her logic. For years, he'd clung to his guilt like a shield, using it to justify his isolation. Now this woman, herself an exile, was dismantling his defenses with simple questions. I was a good midwife once. Seren continued softly. I delivered hundreds of children into the communal pools. I sang the sacred songs, maintained the perfect temperatures, guided new life into being. But when death came, when Lauren died, I forgot my training. I wailed like an animal. I neglected my duties. I frightened the others with my raw grief. That's human, Miles said. Then, realizing his mistake, added, I mean, that's natural, for any sentient being. The silver hearth does not value natural. It values harmony, containment. I disrupted both. Her fingers traced patterns on the metal floor. After they cast me out, I tried to maintain the rituals for Ariel's sake. But without the communal hearth, without the sacred pools, it became harder to believe in their worth. And now, Miles asked, do you still believe? Seren considered the question. I believe in warmth, in sustenance, in protecting Ariel. She glanced at Miles. In kindness from strangers. The rest, I don't know anymore. The conversation shifted something fundamental between them. A barrier broken, a trust established. Miles found himself telling Seren about Earth, about the colonies, about places she and Ariel might eventually find refuge. Seren described her homeworld, its perpetual twilight, its massive geothermal vents, the sprawling communal pools where her people lived and worked. They talked through the night, their voices low so as not to wake Ariel. By the time the shelter's lights automatically brightened to simulate dawn, Miles realized something startling. For the first time in years, he had connected with another being, not just existed alongside them, but truly connected. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Over the next few days, a routine emerged. Miles and Seren worked together on repairs and improvements to the shelter. The greenhouse thrived under Seren's care, with several vegetable shoots now sprouting alongside the moss. Ariel grew stronger, chasing his hover drone through the chambers and asking endless questions about everything he saw. Miles found himself looking forward to their meals together, to Ariel's uninhibited curiosity, to Seren's quiet strength. The shelter, once merely a place of exile, began to feel like something else, something almost like home. But their fragile peace was threatened one evening when Miles noticed an alert blinking on his communications console. An old data burst flare had activated on the relay tower, likely triggered by the recent electrical surges during the storm. The signal was broadcasting their location on a short-range emergency channel. What does it mean? Seren asked, noticing his concern. It means we might have visitors soon, Miles explained grimly. That signal will attract any ships within range. Scavengers, privateers, corporate salvage crews, people looking for easy pickings. Seren's eyes darkened. Will they help us or harm us? On Mir 7? Probably harm, Miles admitted. Resources are scarce, competition is fierce, and 3 people in a functional shelter with a working greenhouse. He didn't finish the thought. Can we stop the signal? Miles nodded slowly. I need to climb the relay tower and manually override the beacon. But it won't be easy. The storm has intensified, and the tower itself is unstable. I'll go with you, Seren stated immediately. Miles shook his head. Too dangerous. You need to stay with Ariel. And if you fall, Seren challenged. If you don't return, Ariel and I will be defenseless when these scavengers arrive. Her voice hardened. I will not be left behind again. Miles. Not by choice. Miles recognized the determination in her eyes. The same determination that had kept Ariel alive through exile and hardship. He nodded reluctantly. We'll go together, then. But Ariel, we'll sleep safely here. Seren finished. The storm dulls external sounds. If we are quick, he need never know we left. They prepared through the night, gathering tools, reinforcing their thermal suits, plotting the most efficient route to the relay tower. By the time the simulated dawn arrived, they were ready. Stay warm, little one, Seren whispered to the sleeping Ariel, tucking his blankets more securely around him. We will return soon. Miles set the shelter's automated systems to maintain optimal temperature and locked the inner door securely. Then, with a nod to Seren, he opened the outer door to the fury of the storm. The blizzard hit them like a physical blow. Visibility was near zero, the wind chill deadly. They roped themselves together and began the treacherous journey toward the relay tower, which stood a half-kilometer from the shelter. Each step was a battle. The snow reached their knees in places, and the wind threatened to topple them with every gust. Miles led the way, using his scanner to keep them on course when visual navigation failed. Seren followed closely, her smaller form hunched against the onslaught. After what felt like hours, but was likely only 40 minutes, the base of the relay tower loomed before them, a skeletal structure of metal and composite materials, swaying slightly in the gale. A maintenance ladder ran up one side, partially encased in ice. We need to climb that? Seren shouted over the wind. Miles nodded grimly. The override is at the primary junction, about 30 meters up. I'll go first. Test each rung. We stay roped together, Seren insisted. If one falls, the other can brace. Miles wanted to argue. If he fell, he'd likely pull her down too. But the determination in her eyes stopped him. This wasn't just about practicality for her. It was about partnership, about not being abandoned again. Together, he agreed. The climb was harrowing. Several rungs were damaged or missing entirely. Ice made the metal treacherously slippery. Twice, Miles's grip faltered, and only Seren's quick reaction prevented a fall. Once, a violent gust nearly tore Seren from the ladder, but Miles's arm shot out, anchoring her until she regained her footing. Halfway up, they paused on a small maintenance platform, catching their breath. Seren's face was tight with cold and exertion beneath her face shield, but her eyes remained resolute. You climb well, Miles observed, genuine admiration in his voice. The thermal vents on my homeworld reach higher than this, Seren replied, though they are warmer. Miles managed to smile at the understatement, then pointed upward. Not much further. The primary junction is just above that crossbeam. They resumed climbing, fighting against both gravity and the storm's fury. Finally, they reached the junction box, a metal cabinet secured to the tower's framework, covered in frost and blinking with erratic lights. Miles pried open the panel, revealing a complex array of circuits and connectors. Many were damaged or corroded, and sparks occasionally leapt between components. The beacon itself pulsed with an insistent red glow, broadcasting their position to anyone within range. What now? Seren asked, clinging to the framework beside him. I need to sever the power to the beacon without shutting down the whole array, Miles explained, examining the circuits. If I cut the wrong line, we lose environmental monitoring for the shelter. If I cut the right one... A particularly violent gust rocked the tower, sending a shower of ice crystals over them. Miles gripped the railing with one hand while steadying Seren with the other. Hurry, she urged when the tower stabilized slightly. Miles traced the circuitry with practiced eyes, identifying the critical paths. "I think this one," he said finally, pointing to a pulsing blue connector. "But I can't be certain without a diagnostic, and we don't have the equipment up here." "Trust your instincts," Seren said simply. Miles hesitated, remembering the last time he'd trusted his instincts. The pediatric facility, Talia, 26 lives lost because he'd made the wrong call. Seren seemed to read his thoughts. "You are not the same man who lost your niece," she said firmly. "And I am not the same woman who was cast out by the Silver Hearth. We are here, now, making this choice together." Her words cut through his paralysis. Miles nodded, drew a small tool from his belt, and carefully disconnected the blue connector. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then the beacon's red pulse flickered, stuttered, and finally died. "You did it," Seren breathed. Before Miles could respond, a surge of energy raced through the junction box. Sparks erupted, and a section of circuitry burst into flame. Miles instinctively shoved Seren away from the danger, losing his own balance in the process. He felt himself falling backward, away from the platform, into open air. Then, Seren's hand locked around his wrist. She had anchored herself to the framework with one arm, while extending the other to catch him. Her face contorted with the effort of holding his weight, but her grip remained firm. With her help, Miles pulled himself back onto the platform. They clung to each other for a moment, hearts racing, before Miles extinguished the small fire with a handful of snow. "Let's get out of here," he shouted over a renewed gust of wind. "The beacon's dead. That's what matters." The descent was even more treacherous than the climb, with several rungs giving way beneath their weight. But they made it down safely, supporting each other at every dangerous moment. By the time they reached the ground, the storm was intensifying further, and temperature readings on their suits showed dangerous lows. They struggled back toward the shelter, leaning into the wind, pulling each other through deeper drifts. Finally, the outline of the dome appeared through the whiteout, a haven of warmth and safety. Inside, they found Ariel, still sleeping peacefully, unaware of their absence. Miles checked the environmental controls, while Seren verified that the boy was unhurt. All systems were functioning, and the beacon remained offline. They had succeeded. Exhausted, they shed their ice-encrusted thermal suits and huddled near the reactor vent, letting its warmth seep into their chilled bodies. Neither spoke for a long time, content in the simple comfort of survival and proximity. Finally, Seren broke the silence. "Thank you for trusting me to come with you." Miles shook his head slightly. "I should be thanking you. You saved me up there." "We saved each other," Seren corrected, "as we have since the moment we met." The simple truth of her statement settled between them. Miles found himself studying her face, the delicate purple hue of her skin, the subtle pattern of darker markings across her cheekbones, the deep violet of her eyes. Beautiful, in an alien way that somehow felt more familiar by the day. "When I found you and Ariel in the snow," he said slowly, "I thought I was saving you, but maybe it was the other way around. Maybe I needed saving too." Seren's gaze held his. Perhaps we all did. That night, neither of them slept in their separate alcoves. Instead, they remained near the reactor vent, shoulder to shoulder, watching over Ariel and listening to the storm rage outside. At some point, Seren's head came to rest against Miles's shoulder, and his arm wrapped around her waist. No words were necessary. Morning brought a subtle change to the shelter's atmosphere. Not just the physical air, though Miles noted the humidity levels had improved with the greenhouse's growth, but the emotional climate between them. The barriers had fallen. They moved around each other with the easy familiarity of people who had chosen to trust. Ariel noticed it too. The boy seemed more animated, more secure. When Miles showed him how to tend a small moss culture, Ariel took to the task with serious dedication, his freckles glowing with concentration. "It's alive," the boy observed, gently stroking the velvet surface of the moss. Like me. Yes, Miles agreed. Everything alive needs care. Water, warmth, attention. Like Mama cares for me, Ariel continued. And you care for Mama. Miles glanced at Seren, who was adjusting a heat exchanger nearby. She pretended not to hear, but a darker purple flush colored her cheeks. Yes, Miles said simply. Like that. Days passed. Then weeks. The greenhouse flourished under their combined efforts. Hardy root vegetables began to form beneath the soil. The moss expanded across its bed. Even a few flowering plants, ones Miles had considered ornamental failures before, began to bud under Seren's careful tending. With each small success, the shelter transformed. What had once been merely a place of exile and survival became something more. A home, being built one repaired panel, one cultivated plant, one shared meal at a time. Miles discovered that Seren had a gift for structural improvisation. Using techniques from her communal dwellings, she created more efficient space divisions, better insulation methods, even acoustic improvements that dampened the constant machine hum. Seren found that Miles possessed unexpected gentleness. Despite his practical, sometimes brusque manner, he showed infinite patience with Ariel's questions and remarkable sensitivity to both their needs. He anticipated when Seren needed quiet reflection and created space for her rituals without being asked. One evening, Miles returned from checking the external sensors to find Seren seated in the center of the main chamber. Before her lay a folded cloth, deep purple with silver embroidery, clearly of cultural significance. Ariel sat nearby, watching with solemn eyes. Miles hesitated in the doorway, sensing he was intruding on something private. But Seren looked up and gestured for him to enter. This was my ceremonial cloth, she explained, running her fingers over the intricate patterns. Every midwife of the Silver Hearth is given one upon completion of training. It signifies our connection to the communal warmth, our responsibility to new life. Miles sat across from her, studying the beautiful fabric. You've kept it all this time. As a reminder of shame, Seren said quietly, of failure, of all I lost. She looked up at Miles, her eyes clear and determined. But I am not that person anymore. The exile changed me. Ariel changed me. You changed me. With deliberate movements, she rose and approached the reactor vent. Opening the safety panel, she exposed the heating element within, a glowing orange coil that radiated intense heat. What are you doing? Miles asked, alarmed. Burning the past, Seren replied. She held the cloth over the element, not in anger or bitterness, but in recognition that life continues, changes form, finds new expression. Slowly, she lowered the fabric until it touched the element. The cloth caught fire immediately, the silver threads sparkling as the purple material blackened and curled. Seren held it until the flames nearly reached her fingers, then dropped the remainder into the metal disposal chute. The smell of burning fabric filled the chamber, acrid, but somehow purifying. Ariel watched wide-eyed, his freckles pulsing rapidly. When the last ember died, Seren turned to face Miles. I am no longer a midwife of the Silver Hearth, she stated. I am Seren of Mir 7, mother of Ariel, partner to Miles. This is my identity now. Miles crossed the room to her, drawn by the quiet certainty in her voice. When he reached her, words seemed inadequate. Instead, he knelt beside her, took her hand in his, and pressed it gently to his heart, a gesture of acceptance, of commitment. Seren's free hand cupped his cheek, her touch feather-light. Then, with the same deliberate care she showed in all things, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a kiss that bridged worlds, cultures, species, a kiss that promised a future neither of them had dared imagine before. Ariel's delighted giggle broke the moment. They turned to find the boy watching them, his freckles glowing the brightest turquoise they'd ever seen, his small face alight with joy. "Family," he declared with absolute certainty. "We're family now." And so they were. The weeks turned to months. The harsh winter of Mir 7 showed subtle signs of abating, not into true warmth, but into a less lethal cold. Miles expanded the greenhouse, adding a second dome that Seren reinforced with innovative insulation techniques. Their vegetable harvest grew more abundant, supplementing their dwindling preserved rations. Ariel thrived. His natural curiosity, combined with Miles's technical knowledge and Seren's cultural teachings, made him precocious and thoughtful beyond his years. He learned to repair simple circuits, to tend plants, to sing fragments of Silver Hearth songs in his clear, high voice. One morning, Miles was adjusting the external sensors when he detected something unusual, a distant humming, distinct from the normal wind patterns. He enhanced the audio feed, frowning as the sound resolved into a familiar pattern. "A ship's engines." He rushed inside to find Seren already alert, her head cocked as if she too had sensed something. "Someone's coming," Miles confirmed. "Probably picked up residual energy signatures from our greenhouse expansion." Seren's expression grew tense. "Scavengers? Or traders? Hard to tell." Miles checked the defensive systems. Minimal at best. "They're not descending yet, just observing." They waited in tense silence, monitoring the distant ship's movements. After what seemed like hours, the humming changed pitch. The vessel was moving away. "They're leaving," Miles said, relief evident in his voice. "Maybe they decided we weren't worth the trouble. Or perhaps they'll return with others," Seren suggested pragmatically. The possibility hung between them, a reminder that their peaceful existence remained fragile, dependent on isolation and obscurity. But instead of fear, Miles felt a surprising resolve. Whatever came, they would face it together. That evening, they sat in the greenhouse, watching Ariel chase his hover drone among the tomato vines. The boy had reprogrammed it himself, with Miles's guidance, to wobble unpredictably, making the game more challenging. His laughter echoed against the polyglass dome, a sound that would have been unimaginable months ago. Seren leaned against Miles, her head fitting perfectly against his shoulder. "I never thought I would feel warm again," she murmured. "After exile, after losing everything, the cold seemed eternal." "I know that feeling," Miles agreed, his arm tightening around her. "The isolation becomes its own kind of prison. You forget there's anything else." "Until someone reminds you," Seren said, looking up at him. "Until someone carries you from the snow and says, 'Live.'" Miles thought about the day he'd found them. How close they'd come to being just another tragedy on Mir 7's unforgiving surface. How different his life would be now if he'd ignored that flicker on his sensor array. If he'd stayed inside where it was safe. "I was hiding here," he admitted, "punishing myself, existing, not living." "And now?" Seren prompted. Miles watched Ariel, whose gleeful pursuit of the drone had led him to discover a newly sprouted seedling. The boy immediately switched focus, kneeling to examine the tiny green shoot with reverent fascination. "Now I'm exactly where I'm meant to be," Miles answered. The next morning brought an unexpected discovery. While checking the external moisture collectors, Miles noticed something unprecedented, a thin trickle of liquid water running down one of the shelter's support struts. Not the typical condensation, but actual meltwater from the ice pack above. He called Seren to witness it. They stood together, watching the impossible silver thread wind its way down the metal and drip into the soil beds Miles had installed around the shelter's perimeter. A soil bed that had remained frozen solid for 2 years. "The temperature is rising," Miles marveled, checking his instruments. "Just by a few degrees, but enough to create a microthaw." "Is it normal, seasonal?" Seren asked. Miles shook his head. Nothing about Mir 7's climate has been normal since the terraforming failed. But this. He gestured to the dripping water. This is something new. They watched as the droplets accumulated in the soil, creating a tiny dark patch of moisture. Into this patch, almost magically, the tip of a tiny green shoot was already pushing upward, a hardy native lichen that had lain dormant in the frozen ground for years, perhaps decades, waiting for its moment. "Life," Seren whispered, kneeling to examine the shoot. "Life outside the dome." "The first in a long time," Miles agreed. They remained there for several minutes, witnessing the small miracle. Eventually, Ariel joined them, his eyes widening at the sight of the green shoot emerging from the previously barren ground. "Is it ours?" the boy asked, pointing to the tiny plant. "No, little one," Seren answered. "It belongs to Mir 7, but we are privileged to see it grow." Ariel considered this, his freckles pulsing thoughtfully. "Will more come?" Miles looked out at the vast expanse of white that still dominated the landscape. "Maybe, eventually, one is a beginning." Back inside the shelter, they resumed their daily tasks with renewed purpose. Miles worked on expanding the water reclamation system to accommodate the possibility of external meltwater. Seren prepared soil beds for their next planting cycle. Ariel divided his time between helping both adults, his natural energy a constant reminder of why they persevered. That night, as Ariel slept in his small alcove, now decorated with drawings he'd made and small treasures he'd found around the shelter, Miles and Seren stood at the viewport, looking out at the stars, visible through breaks in the cloud cover. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Miles asked quietly. "Finding somewhere less harsh? There are colonies that would welcome you and Ariel." Seren was silent for a long moment. "I used to dream of it. A place where we would be accepted, not judged. Where Ariel could grow up among others, learn their ways." She turned to face Miles. "But now I think, perhaps we have already found our place." "On Mir 7, it's still dangerous. Seren, the climate is unpredictable, resources limited." "Yes," she acknowledged. "But it is also ours. We have shaped it, and it has shaped us." Her hand found his. "And there is beauty here, for those willing to see it." Miles couldn't argue with that. He'd come to Mir 7 seeking isolation and penance. Instead, he'd found connection and purpose. The barren moon that had once represented his self-imposed prison now felt like the foundation of something precious. "Besides," Seren added, a rare hint of mischief in her voice, "you humans have a saying, home is where the heart is. My heart is here now, with you, with the life we're building." Miles pulled her closer, still marveling at how perfectly they fit together despite their different origins. "Then we stay," he agreed, "and make Mir 7 bloom." The distant humming came again, several days later, the same ship, presumably, returning to investigate further. Once again, it circled without landing, then departed. Miles enhanced the sensor readings but couldn't identify the vessel type or origin. "They're curious about us," he told Seren, "but cautious." "As are we about them," she replied pragmatically. The pattern continued over the following weeks. The mysterious ship would appear briefly, observe from a distance, then withdraw, never communicating, never approaching closely enough for visual identification. Meanwhile, the subtle thaw persisted. More tiny shoots appeared in the soil beds around the shelter. The meltwater increased enough that Miles was able to modify one of the external collectors to harvest it, reducing their reliance on the shelter's reclamation system. Inside, their little family settled into comfortable rhythms. Evenings were spent together in the main chamber or greenhouse, sometimes with Miles reading from salvaged archive chips, sometimes with Seren teaching Ariel songs from her culture, sometimes in comfortable silence as they each pursued individual projects. Miles found himself keeping a journal, something he hadn't done since before Talia's death. He recorded their daily discoveries, their challenges, their small victories. He wrote about Seren's quiet strength, Ariel's boundless curiosity, the gradual transformation of their shelter from survival outpost to genuine home. And he wrote about himself, how the weight of guilt had gradually lifted from his shoulders, replaced by a sense of purpose he'd thought forever lost. How saving one small family had, in turn, saved him. On what they calculated to be Ariel's 5th birthday, a date Seren marked according to her people's calendar, Miles presented the boy with a special gift, a small, environmental suit, painstakingly constructed from spare parts and modified to fit his small purple frame. "For me," Ariel gasped, his freckles practically strobing with excitement. "For short explorations outside," Miles explained. "With supervision," he added quickly, seeing Seren's concerned expression. "Just around the immediate perimeter, where it's safe." Seren's concern melted into a smile. "A grand adventure for a growing boy," she agreed. The three of them ventured outside together, Ariel bouncing with excitement in his new suit. They kept the excursion brief. The cold was still dangerous despite the slight warming trend, but the joy on Ariel's face as he experienced the outside world up close for the first time made it worthwhile. The boy marveled at everything: the crunch of frozen ground beneath his boots, the crystalline formations on the shelter's exterior, the vast expanse of sky above. When he discovered one of the tiny green shoots emerging from the soil, his wonder was palpable. "It's fighting," he declared, crouching to examine the plant. "Fighting to grow, even though it's hard." "Yes," Miles agreed, exchanging a glance with Seren. "That's what life does. It finds a way, even in the harshest conditions." "Like us," Ariel said, looking up at them both. "We're fighting too." "And winning," Seren added softly, resting her hand on her son's shoulder. That night, after Ariel had fallen asleep, exhausted from his adventure, Miles and Seren sat together in the greenhouse, surrounded by the fruits of their labor: healthy plants, improved systems, signs of permanent habitation rather than temporary survival. "I've been thinking," Miles said, his fingers intertwined with Seren's, "about the future, about what we're building here." Seren nodded encouragingly. "I think we could do more than just survive," Miles continued. Mir 7 was abandoned because the corporate terraforming project failed, but maybe a smaller approach could work, not trying to change the whole moon at once, but starting small, with our greenhouse, our shelter, the immediate surroundings. "A gradual transformation," Seren mused. "Like healing a wound from the center outward." "Exactly. We've already seen it beginning. The slight temperature increase, the meltwater, the native plants awakening." Miles's eyes lit with the kind of enthusiasm he hadn't felt in years. "With the right approach, the right pace, we might be able to create a sustainable microclimate, something that could eventually expand." Seren considered the idea, her expression thoughtful. "It would be challenging, resources limited, progress slow. But possible," Miles insisted. "Especially with your knowledge of environmental balance, my engineering skills, and Ariel's." He smiled. "Ariel's endless energy." "A project for generations," Seren observed. "Not just for us, but for those who might come after." The implication hung in the air between them, a future stretching beyond themselves, beyond even Ariel, a legacy of renewal rather than abandonment. "Is that something you would want?" Miles asked carefully. "To build something permanent here? Something that might outlast us?" Serene's answer was to lean forward and kiss him, deeply, thoroughly, with absolute certainty. When she finally pulled back, her violet eyes shone with conviction. "Yes," she said simply. "This is where we belong, where we rebuild, where we create something new from what was discarded." Miles pulled her close, overwhelmed with gratitude for this second chance he'd never sought, but had found nonetheless. Outside, the winds of Mir 7 continued to howl, but their bite seemed less fierce than before. Inside, warmth flourished, not just physical heat, but the deeper warmth of purpose, of connection, of home. In the adjacent alcove, Ariel slept peacefully, his bioluminescent freckles pulsing with dreams. The hover drone sat inactive beside his bed, waiting for morning games. A small pot containing his first successful moss culture stood on a shelf above, his proud achievement, tended with dedicated care. And beyond the shelter walls, unseen in the darkness, tiny green shoots continued their slow, persistent push through once frozen soil, life returning to a world that had forgotten it, not dramatically or suddenly, but gradually, stubbornly, one small miracle at a time. Just as Seren had once wrapped her tiny child and closed her eyes to die in the cold, only to wake as Miles warmed them both. Mir 7 itself was awakening from its long winter. The path ahead would not be easy. There would be setbacks, challenges, perhaps even threats from the mysterious ship that continued to observe them from afar. But they would face whatever came together. This unlikely family forged in the coldest circumstances imaginable, and in that certainty lay all the warmth they needed. Outside the dome, a thin trickle of melted ice dripped into the soil beds, Mir 7's first true sign of life in a decade. It was not an ending, but a beginning. "We are here," Seren whispered, as much to herself as to the sleeping Ariel. "We stayed." Miles, watching them both, nodded in quiet agreement. "This is exactly where we're meant to be." The moon breathed again, and so did they.